The wind in Wyoming territory did not whisper. It screamed. It clawed at the prairie, ripping dry grass from the soil and flinging grit against the thin planks of Martha June Pickett's shack. Martha June was outside, kneeling in that wind, her knuckles raw and bleeding, her fingers, chapped and stiff, dug into the iron-hard earth. She was hunting for wild onions, tiny purple bulbs that offered more bite than sustenance. But they were something. They were anything. Her stomach was a hollow, aching cavern. It had been 3 days since she had eaten anything proper, and that had only been a handful of parched corn. She was a large woman, built with a heavy frame and broad shoulders, and the hunger felt like a betrayal of her own body. A woman her size was supposed to be strong, hardy. Instead, she felt like a poorly constructed building, sagging under its own weight, ready to collapse. Her shawl, threadbare and smelling of wood smoke and dust, snapped hard against her back. She ignored it, just as she ignored the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Her focus was absolute. There, a sliver of green. She dug faster, the frozen dirt cracking under her nails. That was when she heard the voices, carried on a gust of wind from the shallow creek bed 50 yards away. "He's fit to be tied, I tell you, plumb bowed up. Walt said the man's coming all the way from Boston. And that cook, Jedson, just took his pay and lit out for Cheyenne. Didn't even pack his skillet." Martha June froze. She did not breathe. She sank lower, pressing her body against the gray dirt, making herself small. It was a reflex she had learned well. Voices meant people, people meant eyes, and eyes meant judgment. The jingle of harnesses grew closer. 2 riders, silhouetted against the flat, merciless sky. They wore the brand of the B-Bar-B, Silas Boone's ranch. "Boone's got 3 days," the first voice, a younger man, said. "Walt says this investor fella won't sign the contract if the place looks like a pigsty. Expects what'd he call it? A domestic operation." The second man, older, spat. "Domestic means he wants curtains, means he wants bread that ain't hardtack, means he wants a woman. Well, we ain't got one. Not a one on the B-Bar-B knows how to boil water without scorching it. Boone's gonna lose the drive. We'll all be out of work come spring." They passed, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. The wind tore their voices away, leaving only the sound of the dry grass hissing. Martha June waited. She counted to 100, twice, her breath fogging in the air. Only when the sound of the hooves was completely gone did she push herself up. Her knees cracked in protest. In her palm, she held 3 onions, no bigger than her thumb. She hurried back to the shack, the wind at her back pushing her, hurrying her, as if the prairie itself was trying to sweep her away. Her home was a single room built of sod and scavenged planks. The roof sagged. The wind found every crack. It was not a home. It was a holding place. It was the last remnant of the failed land claim, the monument to the day her life had ended. Her father, a man of weak plans and weaker convictions, had brought them west with promises of 1,000 acres and a new life. He had seen Martha June's size not as strength for the frontier, but as a flaw. She was too much woman, too slow to marry off, too expensive to feed. When the drought hit and the claim withered, they had packed the wagon for Oregon. They hadn't told her until the morning they left. "There ain't room, Martha June," her father had said, not meeting her eyes. "You're substantial. You'll slow us down. A woman grown can make her own way." They had left her with the shack, 50 pounds of flour, and a broken-down mule that died a month later. That was 2 years ago. Now, she lived on the scraps. She scavenged. She mended torn canvas for freighters. And sometimes, on the rare occasion she had eggs from her 3 scrawny chickens, she dared the walk into town. She hated the town. She hated the way Mrs. Davies at the Mercantile would look at the eggs in her basket and then at her body, her gaze sharp with accusation, as if Martha June had stolen the food from her own mouth. She hated the whispers of the other women. "Look at her, big as a prize sow. Shameful. Eating so much when times are hard. They did not know she was starving. They saw her size and saw only gluttony. They saw her solitude and saw only failure. The cowboy's words echoed in her head. Needs a woman. Needs bread that ain't hardtack. She dropped the tiny onions into a pot of water over her small, cold fire pit. It would be a thin soup, but it would be hot. A cook. The idea was absurd. Silas Boone. He was a giant of a man, dark and quiet. A rancher who owned 10,000 acres of wind and rock. He wouldn't hire her. He would laugh. Everyone laughed. She sat on her cot, pulling the threadbare quilt around her shoulders, and waited for the water to heat. She was so very tired of being hungry. 20 miles north. Silas Boone slammed his fist on the scarred pine of his desk. The impact rattled a tin cup full of spent cartridges. He arrives Thursday. Walt, Thursday. And you're telling me Jedson left yesterday? Walt, his foreman, a man whose face was a map of sun-scorched wrinkles, didn't flinch. He stood in the middle of the ranch house main room, hat in hand, took his horse and his pay. Silas said he was tired of cooking for men who acted like wolves, said the house was too cold, said he missed painted women. He was a no-account drunk, and you know it. He could fry bacon, Silas said, his voice a low growl. He stalked to the window and stared out at the brown expanse of his land. The B-bar-B, it was his, all of it, bought with his own sweat and the last of his wife's inheritance. And he was about to lose it. This fella, Abernathy, Walt said quietly, stepping closer. He's not just coming to look at the herd. This letter says he's looking for stability. He's looking for a partner, not just a supplier. He wants to know his investment is safe for 10 years. My cattle are safe, Silas bit out. He ain't talking about cattle, Silas. He's talking about you. Walt gestured around the room. The house was large, built of solid timber, a fortress against the prairie. But inside, it was a shell. Dust coated every surface. Muddy boots were piled by the door. Furs were thrown over chairs, unmended. In the corner, a rocking chair sat empty, coated in a thick layer of dust, a silent, terrible sentinel. It's been 3 years, boss, Walt said, his voice softening. Since Mary. Don't, Silas snapped, turning from the window. It ain't a home, Silas. It's a barracks. It smells like men and leather and stale whiskey. This Abernathy, he's from Boston. He's gonna walk in here, smell this, and think you're just another wild bachelor burning himself out. He won't trust you with a 10-year contract. He'll give it to the Jorgensens. Silas clenched his jaw. The Jorgensens, with their neat white farmhouse and their tidy, smiling wife. The thought was acid in his throat. This contract was his last chance. The drought had been bad, the prices worse. Without this cattle drive, he'd be borrowing from the bank in Cheyenne by Christmas. By spring, the bank would own him. So what do I do, Walt? Silas demanded. Ride into town and marry the first woman I see? We just need to make it look right. For 1 week, we need bread. We need the floors swept. We need stew that tastes like someone cared about it. We need a cook. And where, in 3 days, do you purpose I find a cook who isn't a drunk or a drifter? Anyone decent is already hired. Silas paced the room, his long legs eating the space. He was a towering man, built on a scale that dwarfed normal furniture. He stopped at the fireplace, his hand resting on the cold stone. He thought of money, of contracts, of the crushing weight of the land. And then a memory, faint and strange, surfaced. A church picnic 2 years ago, before he'd stopped going. A hot day in July. And pies, a row of them. Apple, cherry, peach. The crusts were perfect. The Pickett woman, he said, half to himself. Walt looked confused. Who? Martha June Pickett, the one who lives in the old soddy south of the creek. The large woman. She baked those pies. Walt's expression soured. Silas, she's an outcast. Folks say she's not right in the head, lives like a hermit. She can bake, Silas said, his mind working. The desperation was a cold, hard knot in his gut. He didn't care if she was an outcast. He cared that she was there, and he knew, just as everyone in the valley knew, that she was poor, desperately poor. She won't ask questions, Silas said, grabbing his heavy coat from the peg. And she'll take what I offer. Boss, what are you gonna offer? A job, Silas said, jamming his hat on his head. Go get the buckboard. And load it. Flour, bacon, coffee, a side of beef. You're just gonna ask her? I'm not gonna ask her, Silas said, pulling on his gloves. I'm gonna hire her. The knock on her door was so loud it shook the dirt from the rafters. Martha June sprang from her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one came here, ever. Miss Pickett. The voice was deep, muffled by the wind and the thick wood. She stood frozen, her thin onion soup forgotten. Maybe it was the county agent, come to tell her the land was forfeit. Maybe it was travelers, lost and angry. Miss Pickett, I know you're in there. It's Silas Boone. Silas Boone. She crept to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. She pulled it open 6 inches. He was massive. He sat on a black horse that seemed small beneath him, and his shadow fell over her entire shack. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, and his hat was pulled low, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and the dark, unreadable eyes beneath the brim. Mr. Boone, she whispered, clutching her shawl at her throat. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. I have a proposition for you. She just stared. He seemed impatient, his gaze sweeping over her small, broken-down hovel, then landing on her. She could feel his eyes on her face, her body. She flushed, a hot, painful wave of shame. He was seeing the dirt, the poverty. He was seeing her. I need a cook, he said, his voice flat. My cook quit. I have an investor coming from the east. I need my ranch to look presentable. I need a woman in the kitchen. Martha June's mind went blank. She couldn't form a word. I'm offering you a job, he continued, his voice hardening, as if her silence was an argument. 1 week. You come to the B-Bar B. You cook, you clean the house. You make it look like a home. You pretend you're my housekeeper. Pretend, she managed, the word sounding small and foolish. It's a lie. Miss Pickett, I'm paying you to tell a lie. This investor needs to see a civilized operation. You will cook for him. You will cook for my men, and you will keep your mouth shut. At the end of the week, when he leaves, I will pay you. He paused. $50. And you can eat all you want from the pantry. My foreman is bringing a wagon with supplies. $50. It was an impossible sum. It was more money than she had seen in 3 years. It was enough to buy flour for the winter, enough for new boots, enough to survive. Her first instinct was suspicion. This was a trick, a joke, a cruel mockery. Men like Silas Boone did not offer jobs to women like her. They looked through them. They laughed at them. Why me? She asked, her voice stronger than she expected. You could get anyone from town. I don't have time for town, he said bluntly. And town women ask questions. They gossip. You live out here. You don't talk to anyone. You're perfect. You're perfect. The words hung in the air, cold and practical. He didn't mean her. He meant her isolation, her shame. He was hiring her because she was an outcast. She should have slammed the door. She should have told him to go to hell, to take his false money and his cruel proposition and ride off. But the hunger was a cold, sharp blade inside her. $50. And food, all you can eat. She looked down at her hands, still stained with dirt from the onions. I don't have clothes for a ranch house. I don't care what you wear, he said. Just be clean. Can you cook, or was that just pies? I can cook, she said, lifting her chin. Good. Get your things. The wagon will be here in 20 minutes. You'll ride back with Walt. He didn't wait for another answer. He simply pulled the reins, turned his big horse, and rode away, leaving her standing in the cold draft of her open door, her world spinning. The ride to the B-Bar B was 5 miles of silent humiliation. Walt, the foreman, had not spoken a word. He had loaded her small, patched carpet bag into the buckboard, his eyes carefully avoiding hers, and clucked to the mules. She sat on the hard wooden seat, the wind whipping her hair out of its tight, severe bun. When they crested the last rise, she saw it. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of tall cottonwoods. The barns were huge, the corrals sprawling. The house itself was 2 stories, made of dark timber, with a wide porch. It was a place of power, a place of wealth. As they pulled into the yard, the hammering from the blacksmith shop stopped. A man mending a fence paused, his wire cutters held aloft. 3 men playing cards on the porch of the bunkhouse went still. All eyes went to the wagon, to her. She felt the heat rise in her face. She heard a low whistle from the bunkhouse, followed by a sharp "shut up" from another man. They were whispering, staring. She pulled the shawl tighter, her hands knotting in the thin fabric. She wanted to disappear. Silas Boone emerged from the main barn. He strode toward the wagon, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at the men. He looked only at her. Walt, unhitch the team. Get the supplies to the cellar. He turned to Martha June. Get down. It was an order. She fumbled with her skirts, her legs stiff from the cold ride. She climbed awkwardly over the wheel, her foot slipping. She nearly fell, landing hard on the dusty ground. No one moved to help her. The silence of the yard was louder than any laughter. This way, Silas said, already turning his back and walking toward the house. She grabbed her bag and scurried after him, her head down, feeling the burn of a dozen pairs of eyes on her back. He led her through the massive front door, into the main room. It was dark, the curtains drawn. It smelled of stale smoke and old leather. The kitchen is through there, he said, pointing to a door at the back. The investor arrives Thursday. You have 2 days to make this place acceptable. My room is upstairs. There is a small room off the kitchen. You'll sleep there. He pushed open the kitchen door and stood back. Martha June stepped inside, and her heart sank. The room was enormous. A huge, black, cast-iron stove dominated one wall, cold and imposing. A long work table sat in the center, but it was the filth that made her stomach clench. Pans were stacked high in a dry sink, caked with old grease and dried beans. The floor was covered in mud tracks and spilled flour. A burlap sack of potatoes in the corner had begun to sprout long, pale vines. The place hadn't been truly cleaned in months, maybe years. There is salt pork in the larder and beans, Silas said from the doorway. He was not looking at the mess. He was looking at her. The men eat at 6. You'll serve me in the main room at 7. He turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, and then the front door closed, leaving her in the cold, cavernous, filthy kitchen. She was alone. For a long moment, she just stood there, her cheap bag in her hand. This was a mistake, a terrible, cruel mistake. He had brought her here to fail, to be laughed at by his men, to be overwhelmed by the impossible task. She looked at the stove, at the pile of pans, at the pump handle by the sink. Then, she set down her bag. She took off her shawl, folded it neatly, and placed it on a chair. She rolled up the sleeves of her worn gray dress. He had offered her food. He had offered her $50. He had offered her a job. He had not offered her kindness, and she had not expected it, but she would not be beaten by grease and dirt. She found the lye soap. She grabbed a scrubbing brush. She went to the pump and began to fill the first bucket. Hours later, the kitchen was a different place. The stove was roaring, a massive iron beast that she had tamed, its warmth pushing back the bone-deep chill. Every pot was scrubbed, hanging from its hook. The floors were swept. She had found the root cellar. It was better stocked than she had dreamed. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions. She had the side of beef Walt had brought, and the salt pork. She made a stew, not just beans and pork, but a real stew. She browned the beef, simmered it with the root vegetables, and seasoned it with the dried herbs she found hanging in bunches from the rafters. She baked 3 pans of heavy, dense biscuits, the kitchen filled with a smell it hadn't known in a long, long time, the smell of a home. At 6, she served the men in the bunkhouse mess. They filed in, quiet and wary, their eyes wide as they saw the steaming pot and the stacks of biscuits. They ate without speaking, but they ate with a desperate, animal hunger. When they were done, they scraped their plates clean and mumbled, "Thank you, ma'am," to the floor before filing out. At 7, she carried a tray into the main room. Silas was sitting at the head of the long dining table, the only light coming from the fire roaring in the hearth. The flames cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. She set the plate before him, a deep bowl of stew, 2 biscuits, and a mug of black coffee. He grunted, a sound that was not thanks, and picked up his spoon. She retreated to the shadows near the kitchen door, waiting. She was his servant. She didn't know the rules. Was she supposed to leave? Stay? He ate. The only sound was the scrape of his spoon against the bowl and the crackle of the fire. He finished the stew and used the biscuit to wipe the bowl clean. He drained the coffee. She moved forward, her legs aching from the day of scrubbing and lifting. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Boone?" He looked up, and his eyes seemed to pierce the gloom. "No." She reached for his plate. She was tired, so tired. Her ankle, weak from an old sprain, twisted on an uneven floorboard she hadn't seen in the dark. She stumbled forward, the heavy plate slipping from her grasp. A small cry escaped her. She didn't fall. He moved faster than she could have believed a man his size could. His hand shot out. He didn't grab the plate. He grabbed her. His hand closed around her upper arm, his grip like a steel band, steadying her. He pulled her upright, his fingers pressing into the soft flesh of her arm, branding her through the thin fabric of her dress. She was braced for a curse, for him to shove her away. He just held her. For one long, silent second, he just held her. His touch was not mocking. It was not angry. It was just solid. It was the first human touch she had felt in 2 years that was not an accident or an insult. She looked up, her heart pounding, ready to apologize. She met his eyes. The firelight flickered across his face, and she saw what the shadows had hidden. It wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance. It was sadness, a deep, hollow, bottomless ocean of it. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had lost everything and was still looking for it. He let go, his hand dropping away as if her skin had burned him. "Floorboard's loose," he muttered, his voice rough. He looked away from her, back into the fire. Martha June Pickett stood there for a moment, her arm tingling, her breath caught in her chest. Then she picked up the empty plate, turned, and walked back into the kitchen, the warmth of his hand still imprinted on her skin. Martha June woke before the sun. Her room, a small, windowless space off the pantry, was colder than her shack had been. It was the deep, penetrating cold of a large, unloved house. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, and stepped into the kitchen. The massive stove was a black monster in the pre-dawn gloom. She had banked the coals, but it was still hungry. She fed it kindling and logs from the box Silas had ordered filled, and soon the firebox was roaring, casting a warm, flickering light across the floor she had scrubbed clean. She made coffee first, boiling it thick and black, the way she knew ranch hands liked it. The smell filled the kitchen, fighting back against the lingering scent of dust and lye. This was the start of her second day. The first day had been war. Today was occupation. She moved to the root cellar, a dark, earthy cavern beneath the kitchen, and surveyed her limited kingdom. The supplies Walt had brought were a miracle. Sacks of flour, sugar, beans, and coffee. But the cellar itself held the ranch's true stores. Barrels of potatoes, turnips, carrots, and apples, all slightly soft but usable. There was cured bacon hanging from the rafters and jars of preserves sealed with wax, Mary's preserves. She realized, dated 3 years prior. She took what she needed and returned to the warmth. She started the biscuits, her hands working the dough with an expertise born of long practice. This, she understood. The feel of flour and lard, the precise measurement of baking soda, the exact temperature of the oven door against her cheek. She worked methodically. She was not just a cook. She was, by his own words, pretending to be a housekeeper. The investor was coming tomorrow. The entire house needed to look civilized. After serving the men their breakfast, a silent, grateful affair where they ate mountains of biscuits and bacon gravy, she turned her attention to the main house. She opened the heavy curtains in the main room. Sunlight, weak and gray, streamed in, illuminating a world of dust. Motes danced in the air like tiny ghosts. The room was frozen in time. The dust was not just neglect, it was grief. It coated the hearth, the heavy leather chairs, and the empty rocking chair in the corner. Martha June started with the rugs, dragging them out to the porch and beating them with a broom until her arms ached and the dust rose in choking clouds. She scrubbed the floors. She polished the heavy dining table. And as she worked, she found the house's secrets. She found the sewing basket, tucked beside the cold fireplace. Inside was a spool of blue silk ribbon, still bright, and a silver thimble, sized for a finger much smaller than hers. In the parlor, a room Silas clearly never entered, she found a small piano, its keys yellowed. On top sat a framed photograph, face down. She hesitated, her hand hovering, before turning it over. Silas, younger, his face not yet carved into stone, stood beside a small, smiling woman with dark, flyaway hair, Mary. She was fine-boned, delicate, looking up at him with an expression of pure adoration. Martha June's chest tightened. She was everything Martha June was not. She set the photograph back down. Face up this time. She moved upstairs, her cleaning rags in a bucket. She cleaned the guest room first, airing out the mattress, sweeping the dead flies from the windowsill. Then, she stood before the closed door at the end of the hall. His room. She knew, instinctively, that it had also been Mary's room. She knocked, though she knew he was out on the range. She opened the door. The smell of stale whiskey and sweat hit her first. It was a man's room. Dark, the curtains drawn, but the woman was still here. On the dresser, beside a razor and a strop, sat a small, crystal bottle. It was empty, but when Martha June lifted the stopper, the faintest scent of lavender and vanilla rose from it. She saw the indentation on the pillow next to his, the place where he no longer slept. She saw a pair of small, worn leather boots tucked in the corner of the wardrobe. He hadn't moved a thing. He was sleeping in his dead wife's tomb. Martha June felt a profound, aching sadness, not just for him, but for the woman he was keeping prisoner here, and for herself. She, Martha June Pickett, the fat, unwanted woman, was here to scrub the dust off another woman's memory, all to fool a man from Boston. She worked with a fierce, quiet energy. She did not scrub away the perfume bottle or the boots. She did not touch the pillow, but she beat the dust from his blankets, scrubbed the floor, washed the window, and let the cold, clean air inside. When she was done, the house was no longer a grave. It was just a sad, empty house waiting. Silas began to change. He had always been a shadow, gone before sunrise, back after dark. But on that second day, he returned in the afternoon. Martha June was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread. She heard the scrape of a boot on the porch. She looked up. He was sitting on the porch steps, just outside the open kitchen door, sharpening a long hunting knife. The metallic shing 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 of the whetstone was the only sound besides the thud of her hands on the dough. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. But he was there. He sat for an hour, the rhythmic sound of the blade setting a strange pace for her work. She was intensely aware of him, of his size, of the sheer fact of his presence. She began to hum, a low, tuneless sound she used to fill the silence in her shack. She caught herself and stopped, her face flushing. He didn't react, but the scraping of the knife paused for a beat. The next day, the day the investor was due, he came right inside. She was hanging laundry out back, the wind whipping the heavy, wet sheets, snapping them like flags. Her hands were raw and red from the lye water. When she came back into the kitchen, freezing and out of breath, he was there, sitting at the small kitchen table. He had brought in one of the heavy dining chairs. A leg was split. "It's wobbly," he said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her since she arrived. "Yes, sir," she said, moving to the stove to warm her hands. He began to fix it. He had tools, glue, and strips of leather. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his large hands surprisingly deft. He filled the kitchen. He was a mountain in her small space of warmth and flour. She went about her work, peeling potatoes, checking the roast she had started for the investor's dinner. She found herself talking, just as she hummed, filling the space. "This oven has a cold spot on the left," she said, mostly to herself. "Have to turn the bread pans twice." She waited for him to tell her to be quiet. "Mary always burned the bread," he said, his voice low, not looking up from the chair leg. Martha June stopped, her knife poised over a potato. The air vibrated. He had spoken his wife's name. She said nothing. She just went back to peeling, and he went back to his work. The silence between them now filled with a new, shared weight. That night, the storm came. It was not a gentle rain. It was a Wyoming gale, a biblical deluge of wind and water that hammered the strong timber house. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it seemed to split the sky. Martha June lay on her cot in the small pantry room, her eyes wide open. The wind screamed like a banshee. She had never felt so small. She heard a crash from the main room, a log shifting in the hearth. Then, the sound of the front door opening and slamming shut against the frame. She sat up, her heart pounding. Had one of the men come in? Was it Silas? She pulled her thin robe around her shoulders and crept out of the kitchen. The main room was dark, save for the dying, pulsing glow of the fire. The front door was unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind, letting in bursts of cold, wet air. She moved to shut it, and that's when she saw him. He was on the porch, sitting on the top step, soaked to the skin. The rain was driving in sheets, plastering his shirt to his back, but he seemed not to notice. Lightning flashed, illuminating him in a stark, blue-white glare. He was leaning against the porch post, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was not just drinking. He was staring out into the blackness, his face a mask of such raw desolation that she stopped, her hand on the door. This was not her business. This was his private grief, the thing she had been dusting around for 2 days. She should go back to bed. But the wind was so cold, and he looked so utterly alone. She stepped back into the kitchen, put the coffee pot back on the stove, and added a log to the fire. When it was hot, she poured a steaming mug and carried it out. She stepped onto the porch. The wind tore at her robe and stung her face with rain. He didn't look up. She stood over him, holding the mug. "Mr. Boone?" He turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark, haunted. "You'll catch your death," she said, her voice sounding thin in the roar of the storm. She held out the coffee. He stared at the mug, then at her. He took it, His cold, wet fingers brushed hers. He drank it, fast, scalding, and set the empty mug down. She hated the storms, he said, his voice a rasp over the wind. Martha June said nothing. She just stood there, her arms crossed, shivering. Mary. She was terrified of them. She'd hide her head under the pillows, like a child. He took another pull from the whiskey bottle. She was small, always cold. Martha June nodded, pulling her robe tighter. I built this house for her, he whispered, staring out into the rain. I built it to keep the wind out, and it still got in. Lightning cracked again, closer this time, and the thunder followed immediately, shaking the porch boards. She died in this house, he said. His voice was flat. Dead. In our room, right upstairs. The baby. It was a boy. He never even cried. The storm was so loud that day, just like this. He turned his gaze on Martha June. His eyes were deep wells of pain. I once believed in love. Miss Pickett, I believed it was something solid, something you could build a life on. But it's not. It's vapor. It's a breath on a cold day. I buried it. I buried it all. Right in that box with her. And I ain't dug it back up. Martha June watched the rain lash the dark yard. She understood this kind of hollowness. His was born of loss. Hers was born of lack. My father, she said, her voice quiet but clear, used to say I was built for burden, not for comfort. He said no man would ever want me, that I was too much, too big, too plain. He said I'd eat a man out of house and home before I ever gave him a son. Silas looked at her, his focus shifting from the past to the woman standing beside him. When they left for Oregon, she continued, staring at the same spot of darkness he had been. They left me. They said I was too substantial for the wagon. They left me in that sod shack with 50 pounds of flour. That was 2 years ago. I took this job because I was hungry. Mr. Boone, that's all. She did not cry. She had run out of tears for that story long ago. But a deep tremor ran through her, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She was trembling, and she couldn't stop. He saw it. He saw her, standing in the rain, trembling not from weakness, but from the sheer, stubborn effort of standing at all. He said nothing. He just turned back to the storm and lifted the bottle. Martha June picked up the empty coffee mug and went back inside, locking the door firmly against the wind. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had broken, leaving a cold, sharp, brilliant blue sky. The investor, Mr. Abernathy, was due at 1 o'clock. The house was immaculate. The kitchen smelled of roasting beef and apple pie. Martha June had changed into her only other dress, a dark brown wool, and tied her hair back with a piece of twine. Silas came in for breakfast. He looked haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, but he was sober. He sat at the main dining table, not the kitchen. The pretend housekeeping had begun. She brought him his plate, coffee, biscuits, and a bowl of fried potatoes and bacon. She set the plate down. He reached for a biscuit at the same moment she moved to straighten the napkin. Their hands brushed. It was not a jolt. Like static, it was a connection. The dry, calloused skin of his knuckles grazed the back of her hand. She froze. He froze. Last night's confessions hung in the air between them. I buried love. No man would ever want me. He did not pull away. She did not pull away. The touch, which lasted only a second, stretched into an eternity. He lifted his eyes from their hands to her face. He looked at her. He truly looked, past the plainness, past her size. He looked at her eyes, which were clear and steady. He looked at her mouth, which was set in a firm, proud line. She held his gaze. She did not flush. She did not look away in shame. She simply met his stare. He was the one who broke it. He cleared his throat, picked up the biscuit, and looked down at his plate. Martha June turned and walked back to the kitchen, her skin tingling. She was in the barn late that afternoon, fetching a basket of eggs. The investor had not arrived. A runner from town brought word his wagon had broken an axle 20 miles east. He would be there in the morning. The tension of the day, of the waiting, had left her exhausted. She gathered the eggs, the barn quiet and warm, smelling of hay and animals. She turned to leave the coop, and Silas was standing there. He blocked the light from the door. He must have followed her from the house. "Mr. Boone," she said, startled. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his face dark and unreadable. The confessions of the storm, the touch of the biscuit. It was all there in his eyes. He looked like a man at war with himself. "The investor is delayed," she said, trying to fill the silence. "Dinner will hold." He took a step toward her, and another. She backed up until she hit the rough wood of the stall. Her heart began to pound. This was not the sad man on the porch. This was the giant who owned the valley. He stopped, inches from her. He was so tall. He smelled of leather, horses, and the cold, clean air. He reached out, not fast, slowly. He put his hands on her shoulders. She braced herself. He pulled her to him. It was not gentle. It was not a seduction. It was a collision. He pulled her flush against his chest, his grip tightening on her arms. He buried his face in her hair, at the curve of her neck, and took a deep, shuddering breath. Martha June stood rigid, the basket of eggs still clutched in her hand. She was wrapped in him. She could feel the solid, iron-hard wall of his chest, the strength in his arms. He was holding her. He was holding her as if he were drowning and she was the last solid thing on earth. He was trembling, or maybe she was. She couldn't tell. She was so solid, so real, so warm. This was not the ghost of lavender and silk. This was flour and soap and strength. He held her, and for a second, the crushing weight of his loneliness eased. She did not resist. She let him hold her. She felt the frantic beat of his heart against her own. He lifted his head. His eyes were dark, his face tight with a raw, agonizing need. He looked at her mouth. He was going to kiss her. She saw the exact moment he decided. He leaned in. Then, with a sound like a curse, he shoved her away. He didn't push her to the ground, but the force stumbled her back against the stall. The egg basket fell, the eggs smashing on the hay-strewn floor. He stared at her, breathing hard. His fists clenched, but the fury in his eyes was not for her. It was for himself. He looked horrified. "Get back to the house," he snarled. He stalked past her, grabbed a bridle from a peg, and stormed out of the barn. Martha June stood there, her heart hammering, her neck burning where his rough cheek had pressed against her. She watched through the barn door as he threw the bridle on his black horse, mounted in one fluid motion, and kicked the animal into a gallop. He rode out, away from the ranch, heading for the high, cold hills, fleeing as if the devil himself were on his heels. She looked down at the mess of broken eggs at her feet. She slowly knelt, her knees weak, and began to pick up the shells. Silas did not return that night. Martha June stayed in the barn for a long time, the smell of hay and broken eggs sharp in the cold air. She finally returned to the kitchen, her body aching with a strange, deep tremor. She cleaned herself, banked the fire, and went to her small cot. But she did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the house settle, her arm still tingling where he had gripped her, her neck still feeling the ghost of his rough cheek. She felt shamed, and yet she also felt seen. The raw, desperate need in him had been as real as her own hunger. He was gone when she rose before dawn. She saw his black horse was missing from the corral. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The investor was coming. The entire purpose of her being here, the $50, the pretense, it all depended on him. She pushed the thought aside and began to work. She would hold up her end of the bargain. She was pulling the second batch of biscuits from the oven, the kitchen filled with the warm, comforting smell of baking bread. when she heard the wagon. It was too early, barely 9 o'clock. She ran to the window, wiping her floury hands on her apron. A smart, black-painted buggy, pulled by 2 matching gray horses, was rolling into the yard. A man in a dark suit and a bowler hat sat on the driver's bench. Mr. Abernathy. He was 4 hours early. Panic seized her. Silas was gone. The men were out on the range. She was alone. The buggy pulled to a stop. The man, small and neat, climbed down. He looked at the house with a critical, appraising gaze, brushing dust from his sleeve. Martha June's heart hammered. She was just the cook, but she was being paid to be the housekeeper. She smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair back into her bun, and walked out onto the porch. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You must be Mr. Abernathy. We weren't expecting you quite so soon." The man turned. His eyes were pale blue, sharp and quick. They took her in from head to toe. She felt herself being measured and found wanting. She saw the flicker of surprise, then distaste, as he registered her size. "I am," he said, his voice clipped and precise, smelling of the East. "And you are?" "Martha June Pickett. Sir, I manage the house for Mr. Boone." "I see." He did not tip his hat. "Is he here? We had an appointment." "He was called out to the high pasture." She lied, her face warming. "An early calving. He'll be back shortly. Please, come inside. I have fresh coffee on the stove." He gave a curt nod and followed her in. He stopped in the main room, his eyes scanning everything. She saw his gaze land on the clean floor, the polished table, the dust-free mantel. A small, approving noise escaped him. "You keep a tidy house, Miss Pickett. Surprising for a bachelor's camp." "Mr. Boone prefers things orderly, sir," she said. Just then, the sound of a hard-ridden horse echoed in the yard. Martha June nearly sagged with relief. "Silas." He strode in, his face dark with dust and stubble, his eyes red-rimmed. He stopped short when he saw Abernathy. "Abernathy," he said, his voice a low growl. He was clearly furious at being caught unprepared. "Boone," the investor nodded. "You're early. My man's wagon broke an axle. I came on ahead. Martha June, get Mr. Abernathy some coffee," Silas ordered. He was looking at her, but his eyes were cold, distant. The man from the barn was gone. This was the master of the ranch, his walls firmly back in place. "Yes, sir." She fled to the kitchen, her hands shaking. The performance had begun. For the rest of the day, she was a ghost in a play. She served coffee. She brought out maps of the pastures, which Silas and Abernathy spread over the clean dining table. She observed the ranch hands, who came in for the midday meal, shuffle in with a terrifying, unnatural politeness. They held their hats in their hands, their eyes wide, avoiding looking at her. "Ma'am," Walt said, his voice cracking, "this is mighty fine bread. Ma'am." Abernathy watched this all with a keen, satisfied expression. "It's good to see a domestic hand on the property. Boone," he said, stirring sugar into his third cup of coffee. "A man who can't manage a house often can't manage a long-term contract. A woman's touch calms the men, stabilizes the operation." Silas just grunted, his eyes on the maps. Martha June's cheeks burned. She was a prop, a tool, a fat woman hired to look domestic. Late in the afternoon, Silas took Abernathy to inspect the south herd. Martha June was in the kitchen, her knuckles white as she scrubbed a pot that was already clean. She heard their voices as they returned, stopping on the porch just outside the open kitchen window. "The herd is strong, Boone, very strong," Abernathy said. "I'll admit, I was concerned. Your operation has a reputation for being wild, but this," he gestured toward the house, "this changes things. You've settled down. The land is what matters, Silas said. Of course. But stability matters more. A man needs a wife to anchor him. A family. There was a pause. Martha June froze. She's a sturdy one. Your housekeeper. Built for labor. Clearly. But a man in your position, Boone, you could do better than that heavy thing. A man needs a finer wife to represent his interests. Someone with refinement. The words hit her like stones. Heavy thing. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving a cold, sick emptiness. She was used to insults. She was used to whispers and mocking laughter. But this was different. This was a man assessing her as if she were livestock and finding her unfit. She looked at Silas, who was visible through the window. He was staring out at the yard, his back partially to the investor. She saw his hands. They were hanging at his sides, and they were clenched into white-knuckled fists. His entire body was rigid. The muscles in his jaw were knotted so tight she could see them from the kitchen. He was going to hit him. He was going to defend her. The moment stretched. The wind whistled under the eaves. Silas unclenched his fists. He let out a slow breath. The shipping pens are this way, he said, his voice flat. I've reinforced the gates. He turned and walked away. Abernathy, satisfied, followed him. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't defended her. He had let the insult hang in the air, unchallenged. Martha June stood in the kitchen, her hands in the greasy dishwater, and felt something inside her break. The small, trembling hope that had been born in the barn. The flicker of connection from the storm. It all turned to ash. He was ashamed of her. He had chosen his contract over her dignity. She was, and always would be, the heavy thing. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a cold fury. She was not a crier. Crying was a luxury for small, delicate women. Her hurt did not dissolve in water. It hardened, like iron in a forge. She cooked dinner. She cooked the finest meal of her life. She made the roast beef, seared perfectly and simmered until it fell apart. She made potato pies, the crust flaky and golden. She made biscuits so light they seemed to float. And she baked the apple pie she'd found the preserves for, the one from Mary's pantry, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and caramelized sugar. She served them in the main dining room, which was lit by every candle she could find. She moved with a silent, cold grace. She was no longer pretending to be a housekeeper. She was performing the role of a perfect, invisible servant. "My word, Miss Pickett!" Abernathy exclaimed, taking his second slice of pie. "This is finer than any meal I've had in Boston. Boone, you are a lucky man. A treasure, this one. A true treasure." Silas said nothing. He just ate, his eyes on his plate, his face a mask of stone. But Martha June felt him watching her. She felt his gaze follow her every time she left the room. After Abernathy had retired to the guest room, full and happy, Martha June was alone in the kitchen. She was washing the last of the crystal glasses when Silas walked in. He stood in the doorway, filling it, blocking her escape. The rest of the house was dark. The kitchen was lit only by the soft, warm glow of the fire in the stove. "He's pleased," Silas said. His voice was rough. Martha June didn't turn around. She kept washing the glass. "That's what you wanted." He took a step into the room. "Martha June." She said nothing. "About what Abernathy said on the porch." He was struggling, the words coming out like rocks. I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." She stopped washing. She set the glass down very carefully in the soapy water. She turned around. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes enormous and dark. She looked at him, at this giant of a man, at his apology that came too late, at his fists that had stayed at his sides. She stepped toward him and slapped him across the face. It was not a hysterical, wild swing. It was a sharp, measured, open-palmed crack that echoed in the quiet kitchen. It was the sound of her patience breaking. It was for every time she had been called heavy thing. It was for every whisper. And it was for his silence. He didn't flinch. He just took it. His head barely turned. A red mark began to bloom on his rough cheek. He looked at her, his eyes unblinking. He wasn't angry. He looked awake, as if she had finally broken through the ice. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his voice raw. "I'll have Walt hitch the wagon. I'll pay you the 50. I'll pay you double." She stood her ground, her hands stinging, her body vibrating with a terrible, liberating anger. She could take the money. She could go back to her shack, back to her onions and her cold, empty life. She looked at this man, at the sadness in his eyes, at the red mark she had put on his face, and she made a choice. "No," she said. Her voice was low, but it filled the room. "I'm not leaving." She took a step closer, invading his space, forcing him to look at her. "Really look." "But I am done. I'm not pretending anymore. Not for you, not for that man upstairs." She gestured to the kitchen, to the stove, to the clean floor. "I'm not pretending in the kitchen. I'm not pretending at the table." She lifted her chin, and her eyes, clear and fierce, met his. "And I am not pretending in that bed if you come for me." The challenge, raw and stunning, hung in the air between them. She had named the thing in the barn. She had named the trembling, desperate need. He stared at her. He saw her. Not the cook, not the outcast, not the heavy thing. He saw the woman who had faced him down, the woman who had slapped him, the woman who was offering him truth in a house built on lies. The dam inside him, the one he had built stone by stone for 3 years, did not just crack, it shattered. He crossed the 2 feet between them in one motion. He didn't pull her. He didn't grab her. He put one hand on the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her severe bun, and the other on her back, pulling her body against his. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a starving man's kiss. It was fierce, hungry, and desperate. It was all the words he hadn't said on the porch. It was his apology. It was his fury at himself. It was 3 years of loneliness crashing down. He kissed her with a raw, consuming hunger that stunned her. And she kissed him back. She met his hunger with her own. Her hands came up, gripping his shirt, holding on as the world tilted. He broke the kiss only to lift her, as if she weighed nothing, and carry her out of the kitchen. He kicked the main room door shut. He didn't take her upstairs. He wouldn't take her to that cold room, to Mary's tomb. He carried her to the fireplace, where the embers still glowed, painting the room in red and shadows. He laid her down on the thick bearskin rug. For a moment, as he loomed over her, the old fear returned. She was plain. She was large. She had been ridiculed her entire life for this body. She instinctively went to cover herself, to pull her drab dress down. He stopped her. He caught her hand, his calloused thumb stroking her palm. He undressed her slowly, not with lust, but with a strange, agonizing reverence. He unbuttoned her dress, his fingers clumsy. He pushed the rough wool aside. She was shy, her body tensing, waiting for the look of disgust, the rejection. It never came. He looked at her broad shoulders, her full breasts, her soft stomach and wide hips. The firelight flickered across her pale skin. He touched her as if she were made of spun gold. His rough hands, hands that had roped cattle and built fences, traced the curve of her belly. "You're real," he whispered, his voice thick. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her stomach. "You're so real." She gasped, a sound that was half a sob. No one had ever touched her there, not ever. "He called me," she whispered, ashamed. "I know what he called you," Silas growled, his lips moving against her skin. "He's a blind fool." He moved over her, his own body bare, a landscape of muscle and old scars. He touched her face, her hair, his fingers pulling the pins from her bun until it tumbled down over her shoulders. Mine, he whispered, looking into her eyes. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a statement of discovery. He was hers, and she was his. He made love to her slowly, tenderly, on the floor by the fire. He taught her body that it was not a thing of shame, but a thing to be worshipped. And when she cried out, weeping softly in the darkness, it was not from sadness. It was from the shattering, painful, beautiful release of being wanted. When she woke, she was on the rug, covered by his heavy sheepskin coat. The fire was dead ash. The house was gray with the first light of dawn. He was gone. She sat up, her body sore but humming with a new, strange life. She was not the same woman. She would never be the same. She went to her small room and looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She saw the same face, the same wide cheeks, the same plain mouth, but her eyes were different. She looked at the pins in her hand, then, deliberately, she set them down. She brushed her hair, long and thick and brown, and she let it hang free, falling over her shoulders and down her back. She put on her dress and walked into the kitchen to make the coffee. Abernathy came down first, cheerful and rested. "Good morning, Miss Pickett. Your hair is different." "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice even. Silas came in a moment later. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes landing on her. He saw her hair. His gaze was intense, electric. The air in the room thickened, charged with the memory of the night. "Boone, my boy," Abernathy said, clapping Silas on the back. "I've made my decision. The contract is yours. 10 years. We'll make a fortune. I'll just draw up the preliminary papers before I leave." Silas tore his gaze from Martha June. "Good." Abernathy, humming, walked into the small parlor, where Silas kept his desk. "Just need a pen. You keep a fine house. Boone, a fine, orderly house." He idled at the desk, pulling open a drawer. "Ah, here we are." He pulled out a pen, and with it, a folded piece of paper, a thick, official document. He glanced at it, curious. He unfolded it. The good cheer drained from his face. He read it, his eyes narrowing. "Boone," he said, his voice sharp. "What is this?" Silas and Martha June both looked. "It's a marriage certificate," Abernathy said, his voice turning to ice. He read the names. "Silas Boone and Mary Latimer, dated 1877. He looked up from the paper, his gaze darting to Silas, and then swinging, with dawning, furious realization, to Martha June. He stared at her hair worn down like a wife's, at her place in the kitchen. "That woman," he said, his voice low and venomous. "She is not your wife. Mary Boone is—" He tapped the paper. "Or was." He looked at Silas, his face pale with rage. "You've been playing me for a fool. This entire week. That woman, this domestic bliss. It's a lie." He threw the certificate on the desk. "This deal is off. Boone, you're a fraud. I'll be out of this house in an hour, and I'll make sure every investor in Boston knows you're a liar." The silence in the parlor was a brittle, sharp thing. Martha June stood frozen by the dining table, her hair still loose over her shoulders, a scarlet badge of the intimacy that had just been exposed. Abernathy snatched his hat from the hall tree. "A fraud. You built this entire negotiation on a despicable lie." "Abernathy, wait," Silas said. His voice was a low rasp. He stepped in front of the smaller man, blocking the door. The desperation was rolling off him, thick and sour. He was a man watching his life's work burn down. "Get out of my way, Boone!" "The cattle are real," Silas pleaded, his hands clenched. "The land is real. The contract is sound. What difference does this make?" "Difference?" Abernathy's voice rose, shrill and indignant. "It makes all the difference. Integrity is the foundation of business. You hired this This woman, he spat the word, his eyes flicking to Martha June with pure disgust. To impersonate your wife. To trick me. How do I know the cattle counts aren't lies? How do I know the water rights are secure? I know nothing, except that you are a liar. It wasn't like that. Silas was struggling, a bear caught in a trap. He looked from the investor to Martha June, his face torn. The house, it was empty. I needed... He stopped. He looked at Martha June, at her pale, proud face, at her hair hanging free. He turned back to Abernathy. She's not a lie, Silas said, his voice dropping, changing from a plea to something else, something fierce. That woman in the kitchen, she is more real than any person I have ever known. The lie was the dust. The lie was the empty house. She just cooked. Abernathy stared at him as if he'd gone mad. You are truly pathetic. You're ruined. Boone, I'll see to it. He shoved past Silas, who didn't move, and stormed out the front door. A moment later, they heard the sharp crack of a whip and the sound of the buggy's wheels churning in the yard, fast, until the sound was swallowed by the wind. Gone. The contract was gone. The 10-year security, the money, the future of the B-Bar-B, all of it, gone. Silas stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He looked like one of his own fence posts, driven deep into the earth, unmoving, bearing the weight of the sky. He rested his forehead against the doorframe. Martha June's heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She should go. She should retreat to the kitchen, the one place she belonged. Mr. Boone, she whispered. He turned, slowly. The man who faced her was not the man who had held her by the fire. The tenderness, the reverence, the agonizing need. It was all gone. His eyes were dead. They were the eyes of the man who had found her at the shack. The cold, pragmatic stranger. The walls were back up, built of ice and stone. It was a mistake, he said. His voice was flat. She stopped breathing. What? This? He gestured. Not at her, but at the clean room, the parlor, the certificate still lying on his desk. The whole thing, thinking I could fool a man like that, it was stupid. He walked past her, his boots heavy on the floor she had scrubbed. He went to the sideboard and poured a glass of whiskey. Mr. Boone, last night, he said, his back still to her, was a mistake, the biggest one of all. He downed the whiskey in one pull, the glass slamming back onto the wood. The words hit her harder than his slap ever could have. A mistake? She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold, so cold. You don't mean that, she said, her voice a plea. He turned, and his face was cruel. It was the cruelty of a man in profound, self-hating pain. Don't I? Look around. Martha June, I've lost everything. I'm ruined. And for what? He looked at her, and his gaze was an insult. It was the gaze of Abernathy. It stripped her bare. For a week of good biscuits, for a clean floor, for that. He couldn't say it. He couldn't name what they had shared. To name it would be to admit it was real. I can't risk my ranch, he said, his voice a low growl. I can't risk everything I've built, everything my wife left me, for a woman I barely know. A woman I barely know. That was the final cut. After the storm, after the barn, after the fire, he was erasing her. He was erasing them. He was hiding his own terror behind a wall of insults. And he was using her as the barrier. Her pride, the only thing she had ever truly owned, came rushing back. It filled her, stiffened her spine, and cleared her vision. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would not be his mistake. She nodded. Just once, a small, sharp movement. I see, she said. Her voice was as cold as his. I'll get my things. Walt is in the barn, he said, already turning away, already reaching for the bottle. He'll take you back. She walked out of the room. She didn't run. She walked, her head high, her loose hair brushing her back. She went to the small pantry room. She took her patched carpet bag from the hook. She put her old dress inside. She took the apron she had worn, the symbol of her role, and folded it, placing it in the bag. She walked through the kitchen. The morning's biscuits, the ones she had made with a light heart, sat on the cooling rack. She had wrapped 4 of them in a clean cloth, meaning to give them to him. She picked up the small bundle. She walked out the back door. Walt was in the yard, his face a mask of misery. He had heard, of course he had. He had the buckboard hitched. He didn't meet her eyes. "Ma'am." He helped her up onto the seat, his touch respectful. He didn't say a word as they rode out of the B-Bar-B. The ranch hands watched her go. They stood by the corral, hats in hand, their faces grim. They knew. The 5-mile ride was silent. The sky had turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind had a new, sharp bite. It smelled of iron. It smelled of snow. Walt pulled the wagon up to her shack. It looked smaller, sadder, and more broken than she remembered. After the warmth of Silas's kitchen, it looked like a grave. "Ma'am," Walt said, his voice thick with shame. He's a fool. He's blind. He's a rancher." "Walt," she said, her voice hollow. "He's protecting his land. I understand." She climbed down, refusing his help. She took her bag. "The $50, Walt said, reaching into his pocket. He said, "No," she said. "I didn't finish the week."
"But, ma'am, you earned it."
No. She would not take his money. She would not be the mistake he had paid for. "Goodbye, Walt." She turned and walked into the shack, shutting the thin plank door behind her. She heard the wagon sit for a long minute, then the sad, slow creak of it turning and fading away. She was alone. The shack was freezing. The air was dead and musty. She sat on her cot, her bag at her feet. She was back where she started. No, she was worse off. Before, she had been hungry and lonely. Now, she was heartbroken. He had touched her. He had called her real. He had whispered, "Mine." It was all a lie, a mistake. A cold, hard fury began to burn through the numbness. She would not grieve him. He was a coward. He was a liar, just as Abernathy had said. She got up and went to the cold fire pit. She used the last of her kindling to start a small, struggling fire. The shack filled with smoke. She opened her bag. She took out the clean apron. This was the uniform of the lie. She held it over the flames. She watched the white cotton blacken, curl, and then catch, flaring up in a burst of angry light. She took the small bundle of biscuits, her biscuits, made with her hands, in his kitchen. She unwrapped the cloth. They were perfect, golden brown. She had made them for him. She threw them into the fire, one by one. She watched them turn to black, smoking stones. She fed the fire until the apron and the biscuits were nothing but gray ash. Then she sat back on her cot, pulled her threadbare quilt around her, and waited for the cold to take her. The snow began an hour later. It did not come gently. It came on the back of a shrieking wind, a horizontal wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. The wind found every crack in the soddy, whistling, screaming, clawing at the walls. Martha June huddled, her body curled tight. She was hungry. The fire was dying, and she had no more fuel. She was too tired to go out, too empty to care. She coughed, a dry, racking sound that hurt her chest. The cold was moving from her skin into her bones, into her lungs. She heard a sound, a loud crack like a gunshot, right above her head. She looked up. The thick center beam of the roof, already old, was sagging under the weight of the fast-piling snow. Dirt and clumps of sod rained down on her. Another crack. The roof was breaking. She moved to the corner, by the fire pit, pulling the quilt over her head. She had nowhere to go. To go outside was to die in the white. To stay inside was to be buried. She thought of Silas. She hoped he was warm. She hoped he was drunk. She hoped he was miserable. Back at the B-Bar B, Silas was all three. He had locked the front door after Abernathy left. He had closed the curtains Martha June had opened. He sat in the dark, in the main room, with the bottle. He had done it. He had saved himself. He had cut away the weakness. He had pushed her out. The house was his again, safe, secure. It was silent. He had never known a silence this loud. It was not the quiet of dust and grief he was used to. It was the silence of her absence. There was no humming from the kitchen, no smell of baking bread, no sound of her solid, steady footsteps on the floor. The clean house was a mockery. The polished table reflected the dying light, accusing him. He saw the spot on the rug by the fire, and he smashed his glass against the wall. He was a coward. He had let Abernathy call her a heavy thing. He had let her slap him, as he deserved. And then, when she had offered him the one true thing in his life, he had taken it, used it, and then thrown it back in her face. He had called her the mistake. He was the mistake. He was the fraud. The whiskey wasn't working. It didn't numb the feeling. It only sharpened the image of her face when he had said it. The way the light in her eyes had just died. The storm howled outside, a perfect mirror of the chaos inside him. He remembered the storm he had sat through with her on the porch. He had confessed his grief. She had confessed her pain. He stumbled to his feet, the bottle still in his hand, and walked into the kitchen. It was dark, the stove cold for the first time in 4 days, but it still smelled of her. Cinnamon, flour, soap. He stood in the middle of the room, haunted. His gaze fell on the small, scrubbed table where he had sat and watched her work. There was a piece of paper on it, a scrap of brown wrapping paper. He picked it up. She had written on it, in pencil, in a clear, strong hand. It was not a long letter. It was 5 words. I never pretended, not even once. He read it. He read it again. The bottle slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor. Whiskey pooling around his boots. I never pretended. The implication was deafening, but you did. She hadn't been playing a role, not when she'd fed him, not when she'd slapped him, and not by the fire. That had all been real. She had given him the truth, and he had thrown it away to protect a contract he had lost anyway. He looked out the window. The world was gone, a solid wall of white. The storm, the shack, the sod roof. No, he whispered. He said it again, louder, a roar of pure terror. No! He didn't grab his heavy coat. He didn't stop for gloves. He burst out the front door, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs. He ran to the barn, his boots sinking deep in the fast-drifting snow. He didn't bother with a proper saddle. He threw a blanket and his saddle on his black horse, his fingers fumbling with the frozen leather of the bridle. The horse fought him, terrified of the wind. But Silas slammed the bit into its mouth and swung up onto its back. He kicked the horse into a desperate run, out of the barn, into the teeth of the blizzard. The world was a white, screaming chaos. He couldn't see 10 feet. The snow was already a foot deep and drifting higher. The wind felt like knives, slicing his face, freezing his tears to his cheeks. He let the horse have its head, trusting it to find the creek bed. This was the storm that had taken Mary. It was the same wind, the same cold, the same white death. He had been helpless then. He would not be helpless now. He rode like a madman, his body bent low, shouting her name into the wind, the sound stolen from his lips. "Martha June!" It felt like hours. The horse was stumbling, its flanks heaving, caked in ice. He almost missed it. A dark mound, a scar in the white. The shack. He leaped from the saddle before the horse even stopped, plunging into a snowdrift up to his waist. The roof was gone. It had caved in completely. A pile of snow, broken timber, and dark sod. He was too late. "Martha June," he roared. clawing at the debris. He tore at the frozen planks, his hands already raw and bleeding, not feeling the pain. "Martha June!" He saw a flash of color, the edge of her quilt, buried under a heavy beam. He put his shoulder to the timber and heaved, his muscles screaming, pushing it aside. He dug into the snow beneath it. He found her. She was curled in a tight ball, her face blue with cold, the quilt pulled over her head. She was covered in snow. He brushed it from her face. She was limp. "No, no, you don't," he snarled. He grabbed her. She wasn't limp. She was shaking. A deep, violent, uncontrollable shiver. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. A terrible, wet cough rattled in her chest. She was alive. A sound he didn't recognize tore from his own throat. He didn't hesitate. He ripped his own coat from his body. He wrapped it around her, quilt and all, cocooning her, burying her in his warmth. He lifted her. She was solid. She was real. He carried her to the horse, which was standing, head down, shivering in the lee of the ruined wall. He mounted, pulling her up and settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, sharing his body heat. He turned the horse, his back to the wind, and began the long, slow walk back to the ranch, his face buried in her snow-caked hair. The first sensation was warmth. It was not the angry, scorching heat of her little stove. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to sink into her bones, chasing away a cold so profound she felt it had become part of her. Martha June's second sensation was weight, heavy furs, smelling faintly of cedar and cold air, pressed down on her. She was floating in a sea of softness and heat. Her eyes opened. The light was dim, golden. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace. The wind was a muffled scream, a distant battle happening outside the thick timber walls. She was not in the pantry room. She was not in her shack. She was in a bed, a vast carved wooden bed, high off the floor, sinking deep under her weight. She recognized the room, the dresser, the empty crystal perfume bottle. She was in Silas's room, in his bed. The memories flooded back. The rejection, the return to the shack, the fire, the biscuits turning to ash, the snow, the horrible cracking sound of the roof beam, the cold, the blackness. Then his face, his hands, being lifted. She tried to sit up. A mistake. A spasm of coughing seized her. A deep, wet, agonizing sound that tore up from her lungs. The cold had settled deep. Pain shot through her ribs. "Easy, easy." He was there. Silas was kneeling on the floor beside the bed. He wasn't the master of the ranch. He wasn't the cold man who had sent her away. He looked haggard, his face streaked with soot and ice, his shirt still damp. He looked terrified. He held a cup of water to her lips. She drank, the lukewarm water soothing the raw scrape in her throat. "You're safe," he whispered. "The storm. It's still bad, but you're warm." She sank back into the pillows, her head spinning. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was watching her as if she were a ghost he had summoned, a fragile thing he feared would dissolve. "Why?" she rasped, the word barely audible. His face tightened. He looked down at his hands, which were raw and bloody from digging her out. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were stones in his throat. He looked up, and his eyes were full of the same raw pain she'd seen on the porch, but the anger was gone, replaced by a devastating shame. "I wanted to protect you," he said, his voice cracking. "That's what I told myself. I wanted to protect the ranch, protect Mary's memory, protect myself from feeling anything. But I didn't protect you. I hurt you. I pushed you out into that. I almost got you killed." She watched him, her mind slowly clearing, the warmth from the fire penetrating her fog. The apology was real, but the hurt was real, too. "You called me a mistake," she whispered. It was an accusation.
No,
He said, leaning closer, his voice fierce.
I was the mistake. I was the coward. I was the liar. Not you. Never you. You were the only real thing that's happened in this house in 3 years.
They stayed like that, the silence stretching, filled only by the roar of the blizzard and the crackle of the fire. The air in the room was thick with confession. This was the room he had kept as a shrine, the tomb he had refused to air out, and he had brought her here.
I was afraid,
he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear him.
I'm still afraid.
Of Abernathy? She asked. Of losing this? He looked around the room. Abernathy leaving? It wasn't just the contract. It was the proof. He got up, his joints stiff, and paced to the window, staring out at the white wall of the storm. I have a brother, Ephraim, back east, in Boston. This ranch, it was half Mary's, which means it's half his now. Martha June processed this. The giant, solitary Silas Boone was not as solitary as he seemed.
Ephraim hates this place,
Silas continued, his voice bitter.
He always did.
He thought I dragged Mary out here to die. He thinks the land is cursed.
He thinks I'm cursed.
He rubbed his face, the sound of his rough palm against his stubble loud in the room. He's been trying to get me to sell ever since Mary died. He wants his inheritance. He wants to go back to his city life, to his banks and his tidy little world. This contract with Abernathy was the only thing I had to prove the B-bar-B was worth keeping. It was my only ammunition to keep him at bay. He turned back to her, his eyes hollow. When Abernathy walked out, he didn't just take the contract, he took my last defense. Ephraim will hear about this, and he will come. He'll have the law with him. He'll force the sale. He'll take this ranch from me. He was trembling. The giant of a man, the master of 10,000 acres, was trembling because he was about to lose it all. Now she understood. The panic, the cruelty. He had seen his entire world collapsing, and she had been standing in the wreckage. He hadn't been pushing her away. He had been pushing everything away. She took a slow, painful breath. She felt the warmth of the bed, the safety of the room. She thought of her shack, of the roof caving in. She thought of the cold. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The furs pooled around her waist. She was wearing one of his own nightshirts, a rough wool flannel, absurdly large, but clean and warm. He looked at her, waiting for her to tell him she understood, waiting for her to absolve him. She gave him something else.
You don't need a wife, Silas,
she said, her voice stronger now. She used his name, and it felt right. It felt solid. And you don't need a cook. You don't need an investor, and you don't need a contract. She held his gaze, her own clear and steady. You need someone who stays. You need someone who doesn't run when the investor walks out. You need someone who isn't afraid of the snow. She paused, and her voice dropped, binding them together in the truth. You need someone who stays, even after the lies. He stopped breathing. He looked at her. He saw her. Not the heavy thing. Not the convenient solution. He saw the woman who had survived her family's abandonment. The woman who had survived starvation. The woman who had survived him. The woman who had survived the storm. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. He did not touch her. Not yet. He looked at her face, pale and drawn but so fiercely alive. He looked at her hair, still damp and tangled from the snow, spread across his pillows. This time, it was not the frantic, desperate need of the bearskin rug. This was not the hunger of a starving man. This was a choice. He reached out and, with a hand that was shaking, he touched her cheek. His thumb, rough and calloused, brushed away a smudge of soot. "Martha June," he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name like it was a prayer. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch. That was all the answer he needed. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the consuming, angry kiss of the kitchen. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was a kiss that said, "You are here, you are alive, you are real." She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. Not to pull him closer, but just to hold on, to anchor him. He laid her back against the pillows. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face. He moved slowly, his movements deliberate. He was choosing this. He was choosing her. He pushed the heavy furs down, revealing the simple wool of the nightshirt. His fingers went to the buttons, fumbling with them, and he smiled, a small, broken smile. "I'm sorry," he whispered again.
"Stop saying that,"
she whispered back.
"Just stay."
He peeled the shirt from her shoulders. He looked at her body, not with the fire-lit hunger of before, but with a quiet reverence. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the soft curve of her belly, the breadth of her hips. He saw her as a fortress, a haven. He touched her as if he were learning a new language. His fingers, scarred from rope and iron, traced the line of her collarbone. They drifted lower, to the soft skin of her stomach. She shivered, but not from cold. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick. She didn't believe him. Not yet, but she believed that he believed it. His hand moved lower, tracing the curve of her thigh. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her belly, just as he had before. But this time, it was not a claim. It was an oath. He moved over her, and when he joined their bodies, it was a quiet homecoming. It was not a collision. It was a merging. It was the end of the storm. Afterward, he held her, his arms wrapped tight around her, her head tucked under his chin. The blizzard still raged outside, but in the big bed, in the warm room, there was only peace, and Martha June wept. She wept softly, her shoulders shaking in his embrace. She wept for the years of being unseen. She wept for her father's cruelty. She wept for the humiliation in the mercantile. She wept for the cold, lonely fear in the shack. She wept because, for the first time in her entire life, she was not just wanted, she was cherished. Silas didn't ask her why she was crying. He didn't shush her. He just held her tighter. He held her, and he stayed. The storm broke 2 days later. It left a world of blinding white. The snow drifted higher than a man's head. The B-Bar-B was an island in a frozen ocean. For 2 days, they had lived in that room. Walt had brought a tray of food, left it at the door, and discreetly vanished. The ranch hands, working to save the herd from the drifts, understood. The house had a mistress. On the third morning, Martha June came downstairs. Her cough was better. She was wearing one of Mary's old dresses, a practical blue wool that she had let out at the seams. It fit. She went into the kitchen, her kitchen. She fired up the stove and began to bake bread. Silas was in the barn, assessing the damage. The silence of the house was different now. It was peaceful. She was kneading the dough when she heard the horse. It was too soon for travelers. The pass to Cheyenne would be closed for a week. She looked out the window. A man on a tall bay horse was picking his way through the drifts in the yard. He was not a cowboy. He wore a fine, dark wool coat and a hat that looked like it belonged in a Boston bank. He sat his horse stiffly, his face pinched with cold and disapproval. He dismounted and strode to the porch, his boots slipping. Silas came out of the barn, his face grim. He had seen him. "Ephraim," Silas said. His voice was flat. The man, Ephraim, stopped. He was slighter than Silas, pale where Silas was sun-scorched. He had the same dark hair, but his was neatly trimmed. His eyes were the same, but they were cold, assessing. "Silas." Ephraim looked past his brother, his gaze landing on the house. "You're alive. Then, Walt's wire said the contract failed. You've bankrupted us. Get off my ranch. Ephraim." "It's not your ranch." Ephraim pulled a packet of papers from his coat. "It's our ranch. Or it was. I've filed the petition. I'm forcing the sale. You've had 3 years to make this profitable. You've failed. You've dishonored Mary's memory, running this place into the ground. You know nothing about this land, Silas growled, walking closer. I know that it killed my sister. Ephraim snapped. His gaze slid to the window, and he saw Martha June. His lip curled. And I see you've already replaced her. You didn't even wait for the ground to thaw. And with that... The air crackled. Silas, who had been tensed for a legal fight, went utterly still. What did you say? You heard me, Ephraim sneered, emboldened by his own righteousness. You let this place kill her, and now you've soiled her home with that cow. I'm taking this land. Silas, I'm taking it all. Silas didn't speak. He didn't yell, he hit him. His fist connected with Ephraim's jaw with a sound like a splitting log. Ephraim flew backward, landing hard in a snowdrift. Silas, no! Martha June cried, running to the door. Ephraim scrambled up, spitting blood. He was furious. You think that settles it? You brute! You'll hang for this! This isn't Boston, Silas snarled, advancing on him. We don't settle this with paper. He grabbed his brother by the collar of his expensive coat and dragged him upright. You want this ranch? You want to stand here and talk about my wife? Then you fight me for it. He hit him again, a brutal, open-handed blow that sent Ephraim staggering. This wasn't a fight. It was a beating. Silas was releasing 3 years of grief and failure and rage onto the only target he had left. Stop it! Martha June screamed. Silas, you'll kill him! Silas ignored her. He was blind with it. He threw Ephraim against the porch post. Ephraim, his face a mask of blood and terror, fumbled inside his coat. He pulled something, not a gun, a small, gleaming boot knife. He slashed out, catching Silas on the forearm. Silas roared, more in anger than pain. He wrenched the knife from his brother's hand and threw it into the snow. He drew back his fist for a final, devastating blow. That's enough. The voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the red haze. Silas froze. Martha June was standing on the porch. She was not crying. She was not hysterical. She was holding his Winchester rifle. She wasn't pointing it at either of them. It was just resting in the crook of her arm, its presence absolute. Silas stared at her, breathing hard, his sleeve dark with blood. Ephraim, coughing, scrambled away, putting distance between himself and his brother. See, look at this savage you're keeping. She's going to shoot me. Martha June's eyes were not on Ephraim. They were on Silas. She gave him a small, sharp nod. Enough. Then she turned her gaze to Ephraim. Get off my land, she said. Her voice was quiet. Ephraim gaped. He looked from her to Silas. Your land? You stupid woman. This is my inheritance. This house, this land. It belongs to me. You said it wasn't mine, Martha June said, her voice steady, her grip on the rifle firm. She looked at Silas, a look of pure, unbreakable partnership passing between them. Then she looked back at his brother. But he gave it to me in trust, and I aim to keep it. Ephraim stared. He saw the woman, solid and unmoving, holding the rifle. He saw his brother, bloody and silent, standing beside her. He was beaten. He was humiliated. He was outnumbered. He wiped the blood from his mouth with a gloved hand, his face purple with rage. This isn't over, he spat. This is assault. I'll be back. I'll be back with a lawyer. I'll be back with the sheriff. I will take this place, and I will see you both in jail. He stumbled to his horse, climbed awkwardly into the saddle, and kicked the animal hard, sending it slipping and scrambling back through the drifts, the way it came. They watched him go until he was just a dark speck against the snow. The yard was silent. Silas looked at his bleeding arm. Then he looked at Martha June. She was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white. He knew his brother. He knew the law. Ephraim wasn't lying. He would be back. The letter arrived a week after Ephraim's bitter departure, carried by a rider from Cheyenne. The snows had begun to melt under a relentless sun, leaving the world a sea of mud and promise. The ranch was quiet. Silas was mending the porch post his brother had cracked. Martha June was in the kitchen, inventorying the root cellar. The threat of Ephraim's return with the law hung over them, a constant, low-grade hum of fear. Walt handed the envelope to Silas. It was heavy cream stock. The return address was Boston. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers, his heart sinking. He expected a legal summons, a notice of foreclosure from Ephraim's lawyers. He opened it. Martha June came to the door, drying her hands on her apron. She saw the color drain from his face, then return in a dark, confused flush. "Silas?" He looked up, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. "It's from Abernathy." He read it aloud, his voice rough with disbelief. The investor, it seemed, had returned to Boston and spoken with his partners. He had also, it turned out, spoken with Ephraim. Abernathy wrote that while he deplored the deception, he was a man of business. He had seen the quality of the herd. He had seen the meticulous state of the house. Most of all, he had heard from Ephraim Boone, who had apparently sent a furious wire detailing the assault and his intent to dissolve the ranch. "Your brother, Boone," Silas read, "strikes me as a weak and vindictive man. A man like that is poison to a long-term investment. He confirmed my deepest fears about the instability of your operation." Silas paused, his throat tight. He says he's pulling his support. He wishes me luck in the dissolution." Martha June's hand flew to her mouth. It was over. Ephraim had won. "No," Silas said, his eyes scanning the page again. "Wait, there's more." He read on, his voice dropping. "However, my partners and I believe that stability can be manufactured. We believe you are a man of good instincts. If poor judgment, the changes you made to the ranch, even under false pretenses, were the right ones. We are prepared to offer a second chance. We are prepared to honor the contract on one non-negotiable condition." He stopped. He could not read the last line. Martha June stepped onto the porch and took the letter from his trembling hand. She read the condition aloud. "The contract is contingent upon Mr. Boone securing his domestic life and thereby neutralizing his brother's claim. The deal is conditional. Silas Boone must be married. For real." The wind whistled under the eaves. Married. For real. It was an echo of the first lie, a demand, a contract. That night, the house was tense. The letter sat on the kitchen table, a white rectangle dividing them. Martha June had made stew, but neither of them touched it. The fire in the stove crackled. Silas stared at the letter. It was everything he had wanted. It was the solution to Ephraim. It was the salvation of the B-Bar-B. It was a 10-year future. And he hated it. He hated it because it was a gun to his head, and it was pointed at her. He had already forced her into one lie. Now he was being asked to force her into a legal, binding truth. For the same selfish reasons, he was being asked to trade her life for his land. He had called her a mistake. He had used her. He had thrown her out. He had nearly gotten her killed. And now, he was supposed to ask this woman to shackle herself to him, to this broken, failing ranch, and to his violent, complicated life. He wouldn't. "I'm not going to ask you," he said, his voice a low rasp. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the table. They were clear, resolved, and full of a terrible, aching sadness. "Silas." "No, I mean it." He pushed his chair back. "I won't do it to you, Martha June. I won't make you the price for this land. I won't make you a liar again. It's too much." He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the blackness. "I'll lose the ranch. Let Ephraim take it. Let him sell it for parts. I don't care anymore." He turned back to her, And she saw the man from the storm, the man who had held her as she wept. "I chose the ranch over you once, and it was the worst mistake of my life. I will not make that mistake again. We'll go to Oregon. We'll go to California. I'll find work. I'll build you another house. A better one that doesn't leak." He was offering to give it all up. For her, the land, the contract, his legacy. He was choosing her, with no conditions. Martha June looked at this giant, broken man, who was willing to walk away from the only thing he had ever loved, because he loved her more. She thought of her note. "I never pretended, not even once." She stood up. She walked around the table until she was standing right in front of him. He was so tall, he had to look down. She looked up, her face resolute, her eyes clear. "You don't have to ask me, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but stronger than the timbers of the house. He looked confused. "Martha June, I just said—" "I know what you said." She reached up and put her hand on his chest. She could feel his heart hammering under her palm. "You're not asking me to be part of a contract. You're asking me to be your partner. You're asking me to help you fight for our home. You're not the one who is pretending." He stared at her, his throat working, unable to speak. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet kitchen. "I will." He searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt, of coercion, of fear. He found none. He saw only strength. He saw the woman who had faced him down with a rifle. A sound, half a sob, half a laugh, escaped him. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her off the floor. He buried his face in her hair. "You're sure?" he whispered against her scalp. "You're sure?" "I've never been sure of anything," she whispered back, her arms locked around his neck. "Now put me down, you fool. We have a wedding to plan." It was not a grand affair. There was no time, and neither of them had the heart for a crowd. 3 days later, the circuit preacher, alerted by a rider, made his way to the B-Bar B. They held the wedding in the afternoon, when the sun was warm. They did not stand in the house, which still held the ghosts of Mary and Ephraim's anger. They stood out back, under the sprawling, ancient cottonwood tree behind the barn. Its new leaves were a pale, perfect green against the blue sky. The ranch hands were the only guests. They stood in a shy, respectful half-circle. They had scrubbed their faces, combed their hair, and put on their Sunday shirts. Walt stood as Silas's witness, his weathered face split by a proud, nervous grin. Silas wore his only suit, the black wool brushed clean, his string tie crooked. He looked massive, uncomfortable, and happier than any of them had ever seen him. Martha June walked from the house alone. She wore a dress she had made herself in the last 2 days. In the attic, cleaning, she had found a heavy bolt of uncut fabric, a deep cobalt blue, meant for curtains that were never hung. She had cut it and sewn it, her stitches neat and strong. It was not a fashionable dress. It was not white. It was sturdy, practical, and beautiful. As she had dressed, she'd stood before the mirror in his room. She'd brushed her hair, letting it hang long. It needed something. She went to the dresser, to the drawer. She opened it. The blue silk ribbon lay there, Mary's ribbon. She paused, her hand hovering. She was not replacing Mary. She was not trying to erase her. She realized, just joining her. She was becoming another woman who had loved this difficult man, another woman who had tried to make a home in this wild land. She picked up the ribbon. She tied her hair back with it, the blue silk bright against her brown hair. She walked out to the tree. Silas saw her. He saw the dress, and he saw the ribbon. His breath hitched. He knew what it meant. He knew the peace she was offering him. He took her hand. It was strong and warm. The preacher's words were simple. The vows were the old ones, of sickness and health, of richer and poorer. When Silas, his voice thick, said, "I will." Walt had to thump him on the back. When it was her turn, Martha June's voice did not waver. "I will. Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming," the preacher said, "I pronounce you man and wife." Silas looked at her. His wife. He leaned down, and he kissed her. It was a gentle, public kiss, a promise made before his men and his land. The ranch hands cheered. They threw their hats in the air. The long winter was finally over. A month later, the contract was signed. A wire from Ephraim's lawyer confirmed the challenge was withdrawn. A married man, with a new, ironclad contract, was untouchable. The ranch was safe. Martha June decided to host a dinner. It was not a small dinner. She invited the whole valley. She invited the merchants from town, the rival ranchers, the wives who had whispered, and the men who had looked through her. The B-Bar B was transformed. The main room was full of candlelight. The dining table, which she and Silas had extended with planks, groaned with food. There were 3 kinds of pies, potatoes roasted in cream, and a side of beef that had turned for 10 hours. Martha June, Mrs. Boone, stood at the head of her table. Silas was at her side, his hand resting proudly on the small of her back. She saw them looking. She saw the whispers, but they were different now. They were whispers of awe. A man approached her, his hat in his hands, his face red. It was Mr. Davies, the mercantile owner, the one whose look of disdain she remembered so clearly. "Mrs. Boone," he said, his voice hushed. That is to say, this is the finest meal I have ever had in this valley. Truly." "Thank you, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice polite, warm. He shuffled his feet. He looked down, deeply ashamed. "Ma'am, I know I haven't always been neighborly. In town." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I was wondering, if it's not too much trouble, could I have, perhaps, another biscuit?" Martha June looked at him. She remembered the hunger. She remembered standing in his store, her stomach aching, trading her last eggs for flour, feeling his accusing eyes on her body. She remembered the humiliation. She could have shamed him. She could have turned him away. Instead, she smiled. It was a real smile, a smile that reached her eyes. It was the smile of a woman who was no longer starving, in any sense of the word. "Of course, Mr. Davies." She went to the kitchen and returned with the biscuit basket. She picked up the tongs and placed one biscuit on his plate. Then she paused and placed a second one beside it. "Please," she said, "eat." He looked at her, his eyes shining with a gratitude that was about more than just bread. The ranch became known for its hospitality. The B-Bar B, once a symbol of wildness and grief, became the center of the valley. It became known for its fine cooking, for its hearty meals, for the laughter that spilled from its open doors. But some things remained private. One cold evening, long after the guests and the hands had gone, Silas sat at the kitchen table. He was tired, the good kind of tired. From a long day of branding, Martha June was at the stove. She brought 2 bowls to the table. He looked down. It was not the fancy roast she served to guests. It was a simple, thick stew of beef and root vegetables. He smelled it. He looked up at her, his heart full. "This is it, isn't it?" She nodded, sitting across from him. "This is the one I made that first night, when my hands were shaking and I thought you'd send me away." "I was a fool," he said, picking up his spoon. "You were hungry," she said. "So was I." They ate in the quiet, comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words. Later that night, they sat on the porch steps. The vast Wyoming sky was a spray of diamond-hard stars. The air was cold, but she was wrapped in his heavy coat, her head resting against his chest, his arms locked around her. The world was at peace. He held her tighter, his cheek resting on the top of her hair. It smelled of flour and wood smoke. It smelled like home.
"You're not just my cook," he whispered,
his voice rough, his words echoing up into the cold, clean stars.
"You're my home."
Thank you for listening to this story. We hope it brought a little warmth to your day. We would love to know where you are listening from. Please drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're tuning in from. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories just like this one. And finally, share your thoughts in English. What did you think of Silas and Martha June? We read every comment. Thanks again for joining us.